Hyun-woo thought his wife would crawl. He expected Zara to collapse in the mud of the cemetery, clutching his tailored trousers and begging him not to abandon her in her darkest hour. He wanted to see her spirit shattered right there at her father's burial, in front of the grieving crowd and the high-ranking members of his own syndicate. He wanted the world to witness his power, to see that he was discarding his pregnant wife like yesterday's news and that she was absolutely nothing without the protection of the Mafia. But when Hyun-woo thrust that brown envelope toward Zara, with her father's black casket just inches away and her 7-month baby bump visible beneath her tear-stained maternity dress, he had no idea of the catastrophe he had just invited upon himself. He didn't know that the woman he was treating like a penniless burden had just inherited a fortune that could buy and sell his entire criminal organization 10 times over. He didn't know that Zara's father, the man he had dismissed as a simple, quiet immigrant with no connections, had been a global titan of industry hiding a secret legacy worth $2 billion. Hyun-woo walked away from that rain-slicked grave thinking he had finally trimmed the dead weight from his life. He was dead wrong. Zara's story was just beginning, and Hyun-woo's empire was about to face a storm it couldn't survive. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Perhaps you are joining us from Seoul, Lagos, New York, or London. We want to know. The cemetery was eerily silent, save for the low rumble of thunder in the distance. Zara stood at the edge of the open grave, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Inside, her baby moved restlessly, as if sensing the heavy grief and the cold eyes of the men surrounding them. She wore a simple black maternity dress, her face pale and her eyes raw from a week of relentless mourning. Her father's casket sat before her, topped with a spray of white roses. Only days ago, he had been laughing in his garden, telling her stories about the home he had built for her. Now, he was cold and silent, leaving her in a world that felt increasingly dangerous. "Are you holding up, Zara?" her friend Ariel whispered, reaching out to steady her as the wind picked up. Zara tried to nod, but the words wouldn't come. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a jagged cliff. Her father had been her anchor, the only person who saw her as a human being rather than a trophy or a tool. Without him, the shadows of the Mafia world felt longer and colder. She turned her head, searching for a shred of comfort from her husband. Hyun-woo stood several feet away, his silhouette sharp against the gray sky. But he wasn't looking at the casket, and he certainly wasn't looking at her. He was checking his gold watch, his expression one of pure, unfiltered boredom. "Hyun-woo," Zara breathed, her voice trembling. "Please, I just need you to stand with me for a moment." He didn't move closer. Instead, he looked at her with eyes like flint. "I've wasted enough time on this pathetic display," he snapped. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. "Take this. I'm done playing house with a woman who brings nothing to my table." A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the cemetery, turning the sky a violent purple. In that moment, the man she had loved looked like a complete stranger. Hyun-woo didn't wait for her to take the papers, he dropped them onto the casket and turned his back on her, walking toward his waiting black sedan without a single backward glance. Zara stood alone in the rain, the divorce papers soaking into the wood of her father's final resting place, unaware that her life was about to explode in a way Hyun-woo could never imagine. The cold rain began to fall in earnest, soaking through Zara's thin black dress as she stood motionless over her father's casket. The heavy silence that followed Hyun-woo's departure was more deafening than the thunder. The brown envelope sat mockingly on the white roses, its edges curling as they absorbed the moisture. To the onlookers, members of the Korean elite, high-ranking Mafia soldiers, and old family friends, it was a spectacle of ultimate humiliation. The whispers started almost immediately, like the hissing of snakes in the grass. They saw a woman discarded, a pregnant widow with no protector and, in their eyes, no future. Zara's hand trembled as she reached out, not for the papers, but for the wood of the casket. She felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her heart that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. She had given Hyun-woo 3 years of her life, navigating the treacherous waters of his family's syndicate, enduring the cold glares of his mother, and playing the role of the silent, obedient wife. She had done it all for the man she thought he was, and now, he had left her to face the world alone while she carried his heir. Across the cemetery, leaning against a sleek charcoal sedan, a man watched the scene with predatory intensity. Seo-jun, Hyun-woo's fiercest rival within the organization, adjusted his umbrella. He didn't join in the gossiping whispers. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Zara. He saw the way her shoulders shook, but he also noticed the way her grip tightened on the casket until her knuckles turned white. To the rest of the world, she was a victim, but Seo-jun saw something else, a flicker of something dangerous in her eyes that mirrored the lightning above. He knew Hyun-woo was a fool for many reasons, but discarding a woman who had seen the inner workings of their world was a tactical error that Seo-jun intended to monitor closely. Ariel moved closer, shielding Zara with her own umbrella, her voice thick with rage. That coward. How could he do this here? Zara, don't look at them. Don't give them the satisfaction. Zara finally looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the stormy sky. She didn't cry. The tears had been washed away by the rain or perhaps dried up by a sudden, searing heat growing in her chest. She reached down and picked up the damp envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew what it represented, Hyun-woo's belief that she was a nothing, a zero, a charity case he was finally closing the book on. Let him go, Ariel, Zara said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it carried a new, chilling edge. He thinks he just handed me my end. She looked down at the casket one last time, whispering a private promise to her father. He has no idea he just handed me my freedom. As the funeral party began to disperse, Zara walked toward the exit, her head held high despite the weight of her child and her grief. She passed Seo-jun, who offered a slow, mocking tip of his head. Zara didn't flinch. She kept walking, leaving the shame behind in the mud, ready to face whatever awaited her in the shadows of her father's secret life. While the rain continued to wash over the cemetery where Zara stood in ruin, the atmosphere inside the exclusive neon lounge was worlds apart. High above the city, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey. Hyun-woo sat in a plush velvet booth, his tie loosened and a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, Yuna leaned in close, her designer silk dress shimmering under the dim, golden lights. She was the polar opposite of Zara, sharp, polished, and hungry for the status that came with being the woman at the side of a Mafia lieutenant. Hyun-woo raised his glass, the amber liquid catching the light as he toasted to his own reflection in the window. He felt a profound sense of relief, as if he had finally cut loose an anchor that had been dragging him into the depths of mediocrity. To him, Zara was a relic of a past mistake, a woman whose only value had been her quiet grace, which he now found suffocating. He laughed as Yuna traced the line of his jaw with a manicured nail, her eyes sparkling with shared ambition. The conversation quickly turned from celebration to the cold logistics of erasure. Hyun-woo wasn't just leaving Zara, he wanted to ensure there was nothing left for her to return to. He began outlining his plan to reclaim the luxury penthouse, the very home where Zara had spent months preparing a nursery for their child. He spoke about the mahogany furniture and the imported art as if they were spoils of war. He told Yuna that by tomorrow morning, the locks would be changed, and Zara's belongings, the maternity clothes, the baby books, and the few mementos of her father, would be boxed up and sent to a storage unit in the poorest district of the city. Yuna giggled, sipping her champagne. She suggested they redecorate the master suite in a modern, aggressive style, purging any trace of the soft, warm influence Zara had left behind. Hyun-woo agreed, his heart hardening with every word. He convinced himself that he was doing the right thing for the syndicate. A man in his position needed a queen who commanded fear, not a grieving woman who invited pity. He believed he was stripping Zara of her dignity and her shelter, leaving her to wander the streets as a warning to anyone else who dared to be average in his presence. As the music flared and the drinks kept flowing, Hyun-woo felt invincible. He was the master of his domain, certain that he had won the ultimate game of power. He had no way of knowing that while he was planning to take a 3-bedroom apartment, Zara was about to take control of an empire. He laughed into his glass, blissfully unaware that the woman he had just made homeless was now the most powerful person in the city, and his freedom was merely the countdown to his own destruction. The heavy rain had slowed to a persistent, melancholic drizzle by the time Zara reached the small, nondescript law office on the outskirts of the city. She felt drained, her body aching from the weight of the day and the betrayal that still stung like an open wound. She expected a dusty room filled with stacks of forgotten paperwork, matching the average life her father had lived. Instead, she was buzzed through a heavy steel door into a suite that screamed high-level security and quiet, absolute power. Standing by a floor-to-ceiling window was a man who looked more like a general than a lawyer. Jaden Okafor turned as she entered, his presence commanding and his suit tailored with a precision that rivaled even Hyun-woo's most expensive attire. He didn't offer a hollow expression of sympathy. Instead, he looked at Zara with a profound, respectful recognition. "Your father told me this day would come, Zara," Jaden said, his voice deep and steady. He hoped it wouldn't, but he prepared for it nonetheless. Zara sank into a leather chair, her hand resting on the damp divorce papers she still carried. "My father was a retired clerk, Jaden. He lived in a 2-bedroom house and clipped coupons. Why am I here?" Jaden offered a thin, knowing smile and slid a thick leather folio across the desk. "Your father, Samuel Okoye, was a man of many layers. To the world, and to your husband's dangerous family, he was a ghost. But in the world of international commerce, he was a giant. He didn't just work in shipping, Zara. He owned the ships. He owned the ports." Zara's breath hitched as she opened the folio. She saw titles to fleets she had only seen on the news and deeds to estates across 3 continents. The average man who had walked her to school and taught her how to plant tomatoes was the silent architect of a global shipping empire. "He knew who you married," Jaden continued, his eyes hardening. "He knew the nature of the Korean syndicate. He lived simply so they would never see him as a target or a resource. He stayed small so you could be safe. But he made sure that when he passed, you would have the armor you needed to fight back." Zara looked down at a document at the very top of the pile. It was a summary of personal assets, liquidated and held in a private trust in her name. The number at the bottom was so large it seemed like a typo, $2 billion. For the first time since the funeral began, the crushing weight of Hyun-woo's cruelty felt lighter. She realized her father hadn't left her defenseless, he had left her a fortress. She looked up at Jaden, a new fire igniting in her tear-stained eyes. The submissive Mafia wife was dead, buried in the mud with the divorce papers. The heiress was finally awake. Zara stared at the figures on the screen of Jaden's encrypted tablet, the numbers blurring as she tried to comprehend the sheer scale of the power now at her fingertips. $2 billion was not just money, it was a sovereign weapon. It was more than the annual turnover of Hyun-woo's entire district branch. For years, she had worried about the price of baby clothes and the rising rent on her father's modest home, unaware that she was the heir to a global maritime empire. Jaden leaned forward, his expression grave, cutting through her shock. Your father didn't just hide this for the sake of a quiet life, Zara. He did it because he knew exactly who you had married into. He called them the Vipers, the Kong family. To you, they are in-laws. To him, they were a pack of scavengers who would have liquidated you and your child the moment they smelled this kind of capital. He pulled up a digital file labeled Security Protocols. Your father's last wish was a warning. If Hyun-woo or his father, the chairman, find out about this inheritance before the divorce decree is absolute, they will use every legal loophole and illegal pressure tactic in their arsenal to claim it as marital property. In the eyes of the syndicate, a wife's wealth belongs to the husband. If you show your hand now, you aren't just losing money, you are giving them the resources to hunt you forever. Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. She thought of Hyun-woo's arrogant face at the cemetery, his dismissal of her as a waitress he had plucked from obscurity. He thought he was throwing away a beggar, never realizing he was discarding the very treasure his family had been killing for decades to accumulate. So I stay small, Zara whispered, the realization taking hold. I let him think he's won. I let him think I'm struggling. Exactly, Jaden replied. You must be the grieving, penniless widow they expect. You move to the shadows. You live in a place they would never look. While they are busy celebrating your downfall, we will be building a financial fortress that no Mafia army can breach. Your father's shipping lanes are already being diverted to offshore trusts. By the time Hyun-woo realizes his mistake, you will be untouchable. Zara looked out at the city lights, her hand once again finding the curve of her belly. The fear that had paralyzed her at the grave was being replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. She was no longer just a victim of the Vipers, she was the one holding the fire. She would play the part of the broken woman, but behind the scenes, she would prepare for a war that Hyun-woo didn't even know had started. The secret was hers to keep, and it was the most powerful thing she had ever owned. The transition was as calculated as it was grueling. Within 48 hours of the funeral, Zara stood on a cracked sidewalk in one of the city's most neglected districts, far from the polished marble floors and silent elevators of the penthouse she once called home. Following Jaden's advice, she had chosen a cramped, third-floor walk-up in a building that smelled of old brick and damp laundry. To the Kong family spies who were undoubtedly watching from parked cars down the street, she looked like a woman who had finally hit rock bottom. She carried only 2 battered suitcases, her movements slow and heavy as she navigated the narrow stairs. Every step was an exercise in discipline. She had to suppress the urge to call a moving team or order high-end security for the drafty front door. Instead, she spent her afternoon scrubbing grimy windows and hanging cheap, moth-eaten curtains she had purchased from a thrift store. She made sure to leave the lights on late into the night, projecting the image of a panicked, abandoned wife struggling to figure out her next meal. The apartment was a stage, and Zara played her role to perfection. When she went to the local market, she bought only the essentials, generic brand milk, bread, and eggs, paying with crumpled bills and keeping her head down. She wore the same worn-out cardigan every day, her hair tied back in a messy knot. To any observer, she was the picture of a discarded Mafia bride, a waitress who had returned to the gutter after her brief, failed fairy tale. Inside the walls of that tiny apartment, however, the reality was vastly different. Tucked away in a hollowed-out floorboard beneath her bed was a state-of-the-art satellite phone and a laptop with an encrypted connection that bypassed every local server. While the neighborhood slept, Zara sat on a second-hand chair, her eyes reflecting the glow of the screen as she authorized the transfer of shipping containers across the Atlantic and reviewed the security dossiers on Hyun-woo's inner circle. She felt the baby kick, a sharp reminder of why this deception was necessary. Every time she heard a siren in the distance or the heavy footsteps of a neighbor, she reminded herself that the poor Zara was a shield. By letting Hyun-woo believe he had successfully stripped her of her dignity, she was buying the silence she needed to finish her father's work. She was a ghost in the machine, a billionaire living in a slum, waiting for the precise moment to turn her perceived weakness into a lethal strike. The vipers thought they were watching her starve, but in the silence of that small room, Zara was preparing to feast. In a sterile, high-rise office overlooking the city's financial heart, Hyun-woo paced the length of the room, his reflection flickering against the glass. Across from him sat Min-jae, the syndicate's most ruthless legal mind, a man who viewed the law not as a set of rules, but as a collection of blades to be used against the weak. Between them lay a dossier containing grainy surveillance photos of Zara's new life, her carrying a single bag of groceries, her climbing the stairs of that dilapidated tenement, her standing alone on a rusted balcony. Hyun-woo let out a sharp, mocking laugh as he tossed a photo onto the desk. "Look at her, Min-jae. She's living like a rat in a sewer. I told you she was nothing without my name." He felt a surge of sadistic pleasure knowing that his former wife was struggling just to keep the lights on. But his satisfaction wasn't complete. The divorce was moving forward, but he wanted a final, crushing victory. He wanted to ensure that Zara had nothing left to live for, not even hope. "We need to file for sole custody the moment that child is born," Hyun-woo commanded, his eyes narrowing. "I want her to know that she can't even keep the one thing she thinks is hers. I want her to watch me take that baby to the penthouse she was kicked out of." Min-jae adjusted his glasses, a cold smile touching his lips. "It's an easy play, Hyun-woo. We'll cite her current living conditions as a danger to the child's welfare. Look at this neighborhood, high crime, poor sanitation, no financial stability. No judge in this city will grant a penniless, unemployed widow custody over a man of your stature and resources. We'll argue she's mentally unstable from the grief of her father's death. By the time we're done, she won't just be broke, she'll be childless." They spent the next hour meticulously crafting the trap, plotting to use Zara's perceived poverty as the ultimate weapon to tear her life apart. They spoke of her as if she were a piece of property to be liquidated, laughing at the thought of her crying in a courtroom with no one to defend her. Hyun-woo felt a sense of absolute control, convinced that he was holding all the cards. What they didn't see in those surveillance photos was the satellite uplink hidden in the shadows of Zara's room, or the fact that she had already retained the most expensive private investigation firm in the country to document every one of Hyun-woo's illegal dealings. While they were planning to use her poverty against her, Zara was already recording their intent to commit malicious litigation. Hyun-woo and Min-jae were so blinded by their own arrogance that they didn't realize they weren't the hunters anymore. They were merely walking deeper into a cage that Zara had built with $2 billion and a heart turned to stone. The shadows in Zara's cramped apartment felt longer and more oppressive than usual as she waited for the one person she could still trust with her life. When a rhythmic, soft knock finally sounded against the wooden door, Zara didn't hesitate to pull it open. Ariel Danjuma slipped inside, shedding a dark trench coat that was slick with the persistent evening mist. Without a word, the two women embraced, a silent acknowledgement of the war they were now fighting together. Ariel wasn't just a friend, she was a brilliant financial analyst who had spent years navigating the high-stakes world of international banking, and she was the only one who knew that Zara's poverty was a carefully constructed mask. They moved to the small kitchen table, where a single laptop glowed with a series of complex, shifting spreadsheets. Ariel's fingers moved across the keys with a surgeon's precision. She knew that the Kong family's reach was long and their influence over local banks was absolute. If a single dollar of the $2 billion inheritance touched a domestic account, Hyun-woo's father would have it frozen or seized before Zara could blink. To win, they had to be invisible. Ariel leaned in, her voice a low murmur that barely carried across the room. "We're moving the capital through a series of shell corporations in Mauritius and the Cayman Islands," she explained, pointing to a flickering map of global transactions. "From there, it's being converted into a private equity trust based in Zurich. I've layered the transfers so they look like routine maritime logistics payments. To any auditor, or any Mafia accountant, this money simply doesn't exist. It's a ghost in the system." Zara watched the digital progress bars, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of Hyun-woo and Min-jae in their glass office, plotting to steal her child because they thought she couldn't afford a lawyer. They were looking for pennies in her pocket while Ariel was helping her move a mountain. Every click of the mouse was a nail in the coffin of Hyun-woo's arrogance. By the time the sun began to peek through the grimy curtains, the final transfer was complete. The $2 billion was no longer just a figure on a piece of paper, it was a decentralized fortress, hidden in the deep web of global finance where the vipers could never find it. Ariel closed the laptop and looked at Zara, her eyes fierce with pride. "You're ready," she whispered. "You're officially the most powerful ghost in this city." Zara felt a surge of strength she hadn't known since the day of the burial. The money was safe, her father's legacy was protected, and the trap was set. She looked around the tiny, dilapidated kitchen and smiled. Hyun-woo thought he had left her with nothing, but with Ariel's help, she had just become untouchable. The vipers were still looking for a victim, but the queen was already in position. The conference room on the 40th floor was a temple of glass and arrogance. Hyun-woo sat at the head of the polished obsidian table, flanked by Min-jae and a team of lawyers who looked at Zara as if she were a smudge on a clean window. Hyun-woo didn't even hide his disdain. He leaned back, his eyes raking over Zara's appearance. She wore a simple, unbranded black dress and a coat that looked like it had seen better years. To him, she looked defeated, a woman who had spent the last few weeks counting pennies in a dark room. "You look terrible, Zara," Hyun-woo said, his voice dripping with mock pity. "That neighborhood hasn't been kind to you, has it? If you sign these papers now and drop the custody claim, I might be generous enough to pay for your cab ride back to that slum you call home. You clearly can't afford to be in a room like this." Min-jae slid a thick stack of documents across the table. "The terms are final. No alimony, no assets, and supervised visitation at Mr. Hyun-woo's discretion. Given your current financial instability, this is more than fair. You don't have the resources to fight us, Zara. You don't even have the resources to buy a decent meal." Zara didn't flinch. She didn't look at the papers, and she didn't look at Min-jae. She kept her gaze fixed on Hyun-woo, her expression as calm as the eye of a hurricane. She reached into her bag, but she didn't pull out a pen. She pulled out a sleek, gold-embossed folder and placed it on the table. "You're right about one thing, Hyun-woo," Zara said, her voice echoing with a quiet, terrifying authority. "I don't belong in a room like this. I belong in the penthouse upstairs." Hyun-woo barked a laugh, looking at his lawyers for shared amusement. "The penthouse? You've lost your mind. This building is owned by an international holding group. You couldn't even afford the parking fee downstairs." "Actually," Zara said, leaning forward until the light caught the fire in her eyes, "the building was owned by a holding group. As of 9 o'clock this morning, it is owned by the Okoye Trust. Which means, technically, you are sitting in my chair, in my building, wasting my air." The laughter in the room died instantly. Min-jae's phone buzzed aggressively on the table. He picked it up, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he read the urgent notification from the building's management office. Hyun-woo's smirk flickered and faded as he watched his lawyer's hands begin to shake. Zara stood up, the simple black dress suddenly looking like a royal shroud. I'm not signing your papers, Hyun-woo. My lawyers will be sending you mine. They include a total buyout of your family's interest in this district and a permanent restraining order. You thought you were stripping me of everything, but you were just making room for me to take it all. She walked toward the door, stopping only to look back at the stunned man at the head of the table. And by the way, you're evicted. You have 10 minutes to clear out before my security removes you from my property. The aftermath of the settlement meeting sent shockwaves through the city's underworld like a tectonic shift. As Zara moved into her father's sprawling private estate, a fortress of glass and steel protected by a security team that answered only to her, the Kong family was in a state of total collapse. Hyun-woo's father, the chairman, was not a man who forgave incompetence. When the news broke that Hyun-woo had not only divorced a woman worth $2 billion but had also lost their central headquarters to her in the process, the retribution was swift. Hyun-woo was stripped of his title, his luxury cars, and his standing within the syndicate. He was relegated to the lowest rungs of the organization, forced to oversee cargo docks in the freezing cold, watching the very ships Zara now owned sail past him toward a future he could no longer touch. 2 months later, as a soft spring rain fell over the estate's gardens, Zara welcomed her son into the world. She named him Samuel, after the man who had loved her enough to hide a kingdom for her protection. Holding him in her arms, she felt a sense of peace that no amount of money could buy. She was no longer the girl who trembled in the shadows of the Mafia, she was a mother, a mogul, and a survivor. With Jaden and Ariel by her side, Zara didn't just maintain her father's empire, she expanded it. She transformed the shipping business into a global logistics powerhouse, ensuring that her father's name was synonymous with integrity and strength. She used her wealth to fund hospitals and schools, becoming a beacon of hope for women who had been told they were nothing without the men who hurt them. Hyun-woo, now a ghost of the man he used to be, would occasionally see her face on the cover of business magazines or hear her name mentioned in hushed, respectful tones at the docks. Every time he did, it was a fresh blade to his heart. He had thought he was discarding a burden, but he had actually thrown away his own salvation. Zara's story didn't end with a prince or a rescue. It ended with her standing on her own balcony, looking out over the city she now helped lead, with her son sleeping peacefully in the next room. She had saved herself, built a life of purpose, and turned her pain into a legacy that would last for generations. Remember, friends, your value is never defined by those who fail to see it. Sometimes, the people who walk away from you are simply clearing the path for you to rise. And the best revenge isn't a strike, it's a life lived so well, so powerfully, and so happily, that the people who tried to break you become nothing more than a footnote in your triumph. This was Zara's rise, and it was only the beginning. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.